What's going on, everybody? Welcome into another episode of the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. And of course, you can follow the podcast at Pack a Day Podcast. Please make sure to subscribe below if you have not already. Like, comment, help that algorithm out. It is always appreciated. But more than anything, thanks so much for being here. We're going to jump into our main topic right away. No news or notes. I guess Aaron Rodgers said he's not going to play for San Francisco as he was kind of teeing off, getting, kind of not heckled, but kind of going back and forth about, any news, stuff like that. It was said in jest. It's all in fun, but he said he's not going to play for San Francisco. So take that for what it's worth. But I want to jump right into our main topic today, and that is going to be what we learned from 2022, because to me, we sort of get to this point every year. We're heading to the Super Bowl. We've got a phenomenal Super Bowl coming up, Chiefs and Eagles, and I think it's the two best teams in football all year. It should be a phenomenal game, but we get to that point of all right, let's look back at 2022, not just from a Packers standpoint, but from a league-wide standpoint. And what did we learn from this season? What do you absolutely have to have in order to be successful? What are your must-haves? Is it special teams? Is it defense? Is it offense? Is it turnovers? Is it playmakers? Is it high-end player? What is it that makes these teams really, really good? And it goes without saying that there's no perfect formula, right? Different teams are built in different ways and can have different measures of success. That's what makes the NFL so fun, is that there are different ways to build successful teams. There's no perfect formula, and we're going to kind of go through some of that today. But you look at some of the trends in the league this year, and specifically what I was looking at today was your Final Four teams, your Bengals, your Chiefs, your Eagles, and your 49ers. I think we could probably include the Bills in that. Is, to me, kind of the five best teams all season long, the five teams that, in my opinion, had a real legitimate shot at winning a Super Bowl. But I just focused on the Final Four. And at the end of the day, the last one, if you're debating number 4 and number 5, is the Bills and the Bengals. And we had that game in Buffalo, and the Bengals beat the Bills pretty handily in that game. So I focused on the Final Four teams and how, what made them successful, and were there any trends that really set it up that way. So I wanted to look at this from a grading standpoint. I wanted to look at this from a salary cap standpoint and sort of how the team was structured. I wanted to look at this from a statistical standpoint. And then what is it that ultimately makes these teams go? So let's start with salary cap first and foremost, because I've seen some comments lately of well, you've got Aaron Rodgers making X amount of salary cap. You just cannot be successful when you're paying one player that much money. You're done. It's over with. You can't do it. Well, the Chiefs are pretty much proving that that's not the case. But let's go over the quarterback salaries for this team, for these teams first. So Patrick Mahomes, $35.8 million is what his salary cap hit was this year. These are just salary cap hits for 2022. So Mahomes was 35.8. So if you're looking at what basically a Rodgers contract would be if he was actually on the team this year, he's making a little bit less than from a salary cap standpoint, than what Mahomes did just this past year. So you can do it. You just need to play like Patrick Mahomes. He's usually the outlier, right? But if you're going to play like the MVP in the league, which Rodgers did in 2019, 2020, you don't mind paying that money. You have an opportunity to win a Super Bowl with that type of player. Patrick Mahomes is proving that this year, but 35.8 cap hit. Now, the other three, Jimmy G for the 49ers is their highest paid quarterback, although you could put together the three are basically making $22 million combined if you put Jimmy G, Trey Lance, and Brock Purdy into one bucket altogether. But Jimmy G's the highest paid quarterback at 12.6 mil. Joe Burrow at 9.9 mil, and then Jalen Hurts at 1.6 mil. So there is a massive advantage if you've got a player like Joe Burrow making only 9.9 million against the cap, or Jalen Hurts, for goodness sakes, at 1.6 million against the cap. That just allows you to spend so much money elsewhere. And not only have the Eagles been able to do that, but they've also drafted well. They've developed well. They've built this really strong core. And it's just, again, it's that much easier when you're only paying your starting QB, who played at an MVP level through the majority of the season, only $1.6 million. But we have basically the two inverses here, right? Patrick Mahomes, 35.8 million cap hit. Jalen Hurts, 1.6 million cap hit. So just because Mahomes is making a ton doesn't mean you can't build a successful team around him. But it certainly helps if your quarterback that's making that much money actually plays at the MVP level that you need him to. All right, so let's look at then, we kind of go back to, Andy, this was also a very top heavy Green Bay Packers team. There was a handful of players that were making a bunch of money. Can you be successful that way? Well, from an Eagles standpoint, they only had 2 players that were making over $10 million this season as a salary cap hit. Javon Hargrave, $17.8 million, and Lane Johnson, $11 million. So they only had 2. Everyone else was under $10 million. So you talk about a quarterback that's only making 1.6 and only 2 players who are making over $10 million. That again is going to be able to allow you to spread out the wealth through the majority of the team. The Eagles are following the formula, right? Get a young, talented quarterback, making very minimal money, have ample salary cap space, backload some of those deals for some of the players that are older on your roster so they're not making big money in the current year. Go out and sign the free agents that you need, backloading some of those. Don't have many like high-end salary cap hits. Javon Hargrave, Lane Johnson, the only ones. And now you've just got talent everywhere, right? Not to mention you've been picking in the top 10 in some recent years, which has allowed you to get players like Devontae Smith. Like, it is just the perfect formula to build this all-star roster throughout the entirety of your offense, defense, special teams, etc. So the Eagles have sort of, followed the formula to a T. If you have that young quarterback on a rookie contract who's playing extremely well, which Jalen Hurts has been this year. The 49ers had 4 players making over $10 million this year. Jimmy Ward at 12.9, Jimmy Garoppolo at 12.6, their second highest paid player, basically didn't play this year. McGlinchey at 10.8, and then Nick Bosa at 10.8. But again, highest paid player, $12.9 million at Jimmy Ward, and then a lot of money being able to be spread through a variety of different players, your Debos, your Trent Williams, your George Kittles, your Christian McCaffreys. We can go on and on and on, Fred Warner, etc. All those guys were under 10 mil. When you've got high-end players not having huge absorbent salary cap hits, it allows you to build out your roster other places. Cincinnati Bengals had 5 players making over $10 million. Trey Hendrickson at 14.4, DJ Reader at 13.6, the safety Bates at 12.9, Mixon at 11.4, and then Tyler Boyd at 10.1. So 5 guys, but again, no huge exorbitant salaries here, so they're able to also spread the wealth through the majority of their team. The Chiefs had the 2 highest paid players for any of these teams. Patrick Mahomes at 35.8 and then Chris Jones at 29.4. They then had Orlando Brown at 16.6 and Frank Clark at 13.3. So they had a ton of money tied into just 4 players in Mahomes, Jones, Orlando Brown, and Frank Clark. So they tied all that money into 4 players and then had to go out and kind of go bargain shopping at some other spots. Now, they were able to do that. You look at, their secondary, they did go out and sign, Justin Reed, but it wasn't a massive salary. They built a lot of their stuff through the draft. We've talked about how important their 2021 or 2022 draft class was to this team. They've got a lot of starters and a lot of contributors, and then sort of some nice pieces here and there. An MVS, a Juju Smith-Schuster, which they got on a bargain deal. Travis Kelce isn't making all that much this year. They were able to get Creed Humphrey in the second round, who's still on a rookie deal. No sour grapes there. But that's how they've been able to build this team. But you have to be really, really good in your bargain shopping and in your drafting if you're going to tie up all that money into 4 players, and specifically 2 in Mahomes and Chris Jones. If you're looking at the Packers, this past year, they had 3 guys that were making over $10 million, but Rodgers was 28.5 of that against the cap. Bakhtiari was 13.4 and Preston Smith was 11.4. But they also had that ability. And, you look at it from the Chiefs and the Packers, right? Rodgers had a lower cap hit this past year than Patrick Mahomes. And then, Bakhtiari and Preston, their next 2 combined, were less than Chris Jones. And they didn't have anyone near Orlando Brown or Frank Clark after that. So Green Bay, but they spent a lot of money on a lot of these players, whether it be, we could go down the list. You guys know the names: Aaron Jones, Jair Alexander, which is more backloaded, but Devondre Campbell, Rasul Douglas, Kenny Clark. They went out and spent a lot of money on a lot of the players. Just some of the ROI wasn't there that some of these other teams, fortunately for them, unfortunately for Green Bay, were able to get out of it. So the point being here is, from a salary cap standpoint, there's no major takeaway. All of these teams were built in very different ways with very different salary cap structures, and all of them made it work. And you sort of have the 2 teams, the Chiefs and the Eagles, sort of the 2 opposite ends of the spectrum, where the Eagles have that rookie quarterback and they've built out their team and they don't have very many high-end contracts, only 2 players making over 10 million cap hits this year. And then you've got the Chiefs, who have got, almost over 65 million tied up in just 2 players. So two totally different ways of doing it, but those two teams are matching up in the Super Bowl. But once again, it just goes to show you there's multiple ways to build championship caliber football teams, and we sort of saw that this year. And by the way, if you're saying like, all right, but what about percentage of the cap? Well, Aaron Rodgers had a lower percentage of his team's salary cap than either Patrick Mahomes or Chris Jones. Even Chris Jones made up a higher percentage of the Chiefs' salary cap than Rodgers did for Green Bay. So Rodgers would have been third for any of those teams, but once again, if your high-end players like Mahomes, Chris Jones play like high-end players, you don't mind paying those high-end salaries. Nobody was complaining about Aaron Rodgers' cap hit in 2019 and 2020 because he was the freaking, or 2020 and 2021 because he was the freaking MVP of the league. In 2022, when you're making a high-end cap hit and you're not playing like the MVP of the league, that's when it starts to become a problem. And we've talked about this before. It becomes a dog chasing its tail. Did Rodgers need more weapons and did Rodgers need more other stuff? Yeah, but you sort of need some more salary cap and equity and things like that to go get some of those players. But we digress. That's not our main topic for today. All right, so then let's go from a grading standpoint. So unfortunately, I can't go and grade every team and every game and every player. I can do that for Green Bay, but I can't do it for everyone. So we're going to have to lean a little bit on Pro Football Focus's grades. So if we're just looking at overall grades from PFF, how about just overall defensive grades? And I wanted to look at where all of these teams were in the top 10. All four teams had a top 10 defensive grade from Pro Football Focus. The Eagles were 1, the 49ers were 3, the Chiefs were 5, the Bengals were 10. So all top 10 defenses per Pro Football Focus's grades. All right. And you really look at the Bengals are going to end up being the outlier for a lot of these. And you'll sort of see that as we go on. But basically, Eagles, 49ers, Chiefs, all top 5 defenses, right? Bengals were 10. The Packers were the 20th defense by Pro Football Focus's grades. How about from an offensive standpoint? Overall offense, Chiefs 1, Eagles 2, 49ers 4, Bengals 6. So they all had top 6 offenses and all had top 10 defenses. These are your final 4 teams. So you might say, yeah, no kidding, Andy. The top 4 teams that made it to the championship games are good at football. Like, I get it. But like sometimes maybe you had a team that was number 1 in offense and 25 in defense, or number 1 in defense and 20th in offense or something. No, these were all top 10 offenses per Pro Football Focus, and they were all top 6 defenses. So you need to get that. By the way, the Packers were 12th, tied for 12th in PFF's defensive grade. So all top 10 offenses, Packers were 20th. All top 6 defenses, Packers were 12th. So that is, other way around. The Eagles were 1 on defense. I did these transposed. So Eagles were 1 on defense. 49ers were 3rd on defense. Chiefs were 5th on defense. Bengals were 10th on defense. Packers were 20th. Offensively, Chiefs 1, Eagles 2, 49ers 4, Bengals 6, Packers tied for 12th. So sorry for transposing those, but that's where we're at. Either way, top 6 offenses all the way around, top 10 defenses all the way around. Packers were 20th defense, 12th tied for offense. The next one that was interesting to me was overall receiving grade. So I want to be clear here. This is not just wide receivers. This is weapons in the receiving game. So this is your running backs, your tight ends, your wide receivers out in the passing game. What were their overall grades? The 49ers were 1, not surprising with all their weapons. The Chiefs were 3. The Bengals were 6. The Eagles were 7. And we're going to get more into playmakers in just a moment. But this is basically, you need to have playmakers on your team. You need to have guys that are out in routes or with the ball in their hands, making things happen. 49ers 1, Chiefs 3, Bengals 6, Eagles 7. The Packers were 23rd. So for those of you who want to say like, yeah, well, Andy, Rodgers would play better if he had better weapons. Maybe. If he had the Eagles weapons, if he had the Bengals weapons, Chiefs weapons, 49ers weapons, yeah, Rodgers would probably have played better. I don't think there's much question about that. The Packers ended up in 23rd in that grade, nowhere near. All the other teams in the Final Four were in the top 7 in overall receiving grade. The other side, how about coverage grade? So we're talking about playmakers on one side and basically stopping playmakers on the other side. 49ers were 1 in coverage, Eagles were 2, Chiefs were 3, Bengals were 7. The Packers were 12th in that grade. So again, a step below those top teams, but all of them top 7 in coverage grades. How about the ones that, well, like one that stood out that didn't matter at all? Special teams. Not one of the Final Four teams was graded in the top 10 in special teams. The Chiefs were 11th at the best, and then Bengals 21st, 49ers 24th, Eagles 29th. The Packers were 26th, by the way. So special teams, it's nice to see that Green Bay was better this year. They weren't losing them games as much, but in some cases, certainly with Keyshawn Nixon, were really helping. But special teams, running the football, like there was always outliers with some of those teams. Those weren't the key indicators. It was the overall offense, overall defense, your playmakers on offense, and then your ability to basically stop the pass and stop those playmakers on defense. All right, then I went to sort of some individual grades, and I want to go back to playmakers for a moment. 49ers had Christian McCaffrey, the number 2 running back, George Kittle, the number 2 tight end, and then they had Brandon Ayuk, PFF's 19th wide receiver, and Deebo Samuel, their 29th wide receiver. Talk about a plethora of weapons, right? Number 2 running back, number 2 tight end, 19th wide receiver, 29th wide receiver. That doesn't even mention like Elijah Mitchell or just some of the other really fun weapons that this team has, but that is just a massive amount of weapons. The Chiefs didn't have as many, but Travis Kelce, the number 1 tight end, and quite clearly one of the biggest playmakers in all of the NFL. And then they had a bunch of smattering of nice weapons around him, and Tony, MVS, Juju, Edwards-Helaire, McKinnon, etc. Just like a really, and Pacheco, like really good players, but Kelce was the huge one here. Eagles, number 4 tight end in Dallas Goedert, number 6 wide receiver in A.J. Brown, number 16 wide receiver in Devontae Smith. Massive playmaking ability. And then they've got a nice stable of running backs, obviously amazing offensive line that helps everything else out, a dual threat quarterback, but they've got playmakers. The Bengals, Jamar Chase, number 10 wide receiver, T. Higgins, number 20 wide receiver. And that doesn't, again, even consider guys like Tyler Boyd, Joe Mixon, etc. So you need to have, at minimum, a top-end playmaker like a Travis Kelce or a variety of weapons that you can go to. And even with the Chiefs, with Kelce, where some of the other guys didn't grade out quite as well, it's still an impressive stable of weapons that have all different skill sets that they can bring to the table. So I think it's safe to say you at minimum need to have one big time playmaker, but you basically need to have multiple playmakers that you can lean on that can consistently make things happen and consistently make things a problem for opposing defenses. By the way, Packers, Aaron Jones, the 6th best running back, Dillon, the 10th best running back, and Christian Watson, the 24th best wide receiver. And I do think that tells a little bit of a story for Green Bay as well, because if you think about when Christian Watson really started to show off against Dallas and then through the remainder of the year, and that was right about the time, maybe a little bit after that, where A.J. Dillon started to get into December, January form, this team on offense at times, not always, and certainly not in the last game and things like that, but at times looked a lot better, right? You had a really nice stable of running backs in Jones and Dillon that were both playing well, and then you had a playmaker in Christian Watson. We saw more out of the offense, more opportunities for the offense. Was it perfect? No. Is there still a lot of work to be done? Yes. But when those three were all going well, you saw a little bit more from this offense. When they weren't, when it was, whether Jones was having troubles with the fumbles, Dillon had a really slow start to the year, Christian Watson with the injuries early in the year, if you were missing any of those guys that weren't performing as well, we really saw the offense struggle. But maybe not super far away, but you can still say, quite arguably, that Green Bay still needs to add more weapons if they want to compete from a weapon standpoint with some of those other teams. Another thing that all teams had in common is they had, at minimum, one key pass rusher. So for the 49ers, they had Nick Bosa. For the Eagles, they had just a crazy amount of pass rushers, but Brandon Graham, Hassan Reddick, Josh Sweat, and then Javon Hargrave, just 4 really premium players on the defensive line, or pass rush, etc. Bengals had Trey Hendrickson, 15th best. I think he was actually in top 10 if you just look at pass rush. And then the Chiefs had Chris Jones. So all of these teams had, at minimum, the Eagles had 4 of them basically, but Bosa, Hendrickson, and Jones, all top tier pass rushers. So you need at least one of those guys. For Rashawn Gary, he would have been tied with Trey Hendrickson basically on the edge. So they have that guy. And that's why, to me, when Rashawn Gary went down last year, that was the team was already struggling so bad at that point, but that was just like the final dagger where it's like, all right, even if they make a run at this thing and get in the playoffs, you have to have that one premium pass rusher, and they didn't have that anymore. So getting Rashawn Gary back this year and having him play at a very high level is going to be so important for the Packers, regardless of what ends up happening with this team at quarterback or any other position. All right, statistically, some of the stats that really stood out. All of the final 4 teams were top 10 in yards per attempt. So from a passing standpoint, yards per attempt, the Chiefs were 2, the Eagles were 3, the 49ers were 4, the Bengals were 9, the Packers were down at 19. So work to do there. Quarterback rating, again, quarterback clearly very important. But if you just look at QB rating, Chiefs were 1, 49ers 2, Bengals 3, Eagles were 6. The Packers were down at 13. Offensively, points per game. KC and Philly both number 1. San Francisco was 6. Cincy was 7. Green Bay was down at 14. And then the big one, the big analytical nerdy one, Justice Mosqueda is very big on this one. Also, if you didn't have an opportunity to check out our episode from yesterday, make sure to do that. Justice is the best. But adjusted net yards per pass attempt. It's a huge statistic used in the analytical community. I've talked about it before. This is net if you combine the offense with the defense and your overall adjusted net yards per pass attempt, again, offensively and defensively for your entire team. The Eagles were number 1. The Chiefs were number 2. Your top 2 teams in this advanced analytic that the analytics love, those 2 teams ended up in the Super Bowl. Number 3 was the San Francisco 49ers. Number 7 was the Cincinnati Bengals. So you want to look at it from a nerdy analytical standpoint. The nerds got it right this time. Eagles were 1, Chiefs were 2. Those were your final 2 teams. And then 49ers 3, Bengals 7. The Packers were 13th in that combined statistic, by the way. So not like insanely far off, but still, 10 or 12 teams that they need to jump up to get in the top of that list and be competing for those spots. So what do we take away from all of this? Those were all the categories that we could see trends for all of the top 4 teams. Number 1 to me is that all of these teams are built differently. And yes, you can see some playmakers, you can see some pass rushers, there's some things like that you can take away. But from a pure salary cap standpoint and how teams are spending money, all these teams are built a little bit differently. Some use the draft differently, free agency differently, trades differently. There's still no perfect one-way formula to build a team. Clearly, if you can get that quarterback that's playing at a Jalen Hurts level on a $1 million deal, that's going to help you a ton to build out the remainder of your roster and have you compete. It's hard to do that, but if you can follow that formula, that's still a very good formula to follow. Number 2, you need a top 10 offense and you need a top 10 defense. And the Packers had neither. And could you be an outlier, maybe be the 12th defense if you have the number 1 offense, or the 12th offense if you have the number 1 defense? Maybe, but you're going to run into some different matchups as you get through the playoffs, and you just need to be really good at both. So you have to somehow find a way to build a top 10 offense and a top 10 defense. If you want to get in the conversation, you can be a good team and get into the playoffs and really make some noise. If you want to win a Super Bowl, if you want to win a championship, it certainly feels like you need to have top 10 in both of those. And we saw that this year. Number 3, and we talked about this on really throughout today's show, but you have to have playmakers. And you have to have guys that can get the ball in their hands and just make special things happen. Whether it's a Travis Kelce, an AJ Brown, a Devontae Smith, a Jamar Chase. Like we've talked about Christian McCaffrey, George Kittle, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel. All of these players, right? Tremendous football players. You have to have those guys who can do the heavy lifting on your offense. It's really nice to have a Joe Burrow. It's really nice to have a Josh Allen. It's really nice to have a Patrick Mahomes and those type of players, but you have to have guys that go with them. And those are usually the best teams that have that high. And we even saw it in Green Bay, right? It wasn't enough. They needed more. We talked about you need an offense and a defense. And a lot of those years, Green Bay didn't have the defense, but you have Rodgers and Devontae Adams. Rodgers playing MVP level. Devontae Adams being the number 1. That's going to win you a lot of games. We saw that. They didn't have that this year, and they struggled because of it. So you need to have playmakers. Number 4, we talked about this. You need to have at least one dynamic pass rusher. All of these teams did. And then number 5, I think the big, huge takeaway here is pass offense and pass defense are still king. And how I would build a team right now in the modern NFL, I would start by putting together a video game offense. Like, sincerely, you can't win in the NFL with just a video game offense. And Green Bay's, for years, in a way, has sort of been a great example of that. Yeah, I look at some of their 13-win, 15-win seasons, where they, especially going back, or even when you just had Rodgers and Adams, or when you had the, 15-1 season. You know what? Like, you can be really, really good, but you still have to pair a defense with it. But I would start by setting up a video game offense. Make it so that you have an offense that opposing teams are losing sleep over and trying to stop you. And if you don't have a good enough defense, you're still going to end up losing in the playoffs. But to me, that's where it starts. And then once you have that, now don't necessarily go out, because if you don't have a video game offense, what do you have to be good at? almost everything. Your margin for error on special teams is small. Your margin for error on defense, you have to be able to stop the run and you have to be able to stop the pass. You have to be able to run the ball on offense to set up your play action, and like everything is hard, right? But if you have the ability to put up points on offense, now some of the special team stuff matters a little bit less. And what do you really need to be good at on defense? Pass defense. We talked about it. Pass offense, pass defense are king. And it starts with you needing to, be able to put up points and get teams in a shootout. And you can do that. Now, get your Rashawn Gary, get your Jair Alexander. Like, in a way, Green Bay is set up defensively to do exactly that. This is a team that doesn't want to do all the little stuff on defense. They don't want to tackle great. They don't want to stop the run on early downs. They want Green Bay's offense to go out and put up a crap ton of points so that Rashawn Gary and Preston Smith and Kingsley Enagbare and Kenny Clark and Devontae Wyatt and those guys can get after the quarterback. Devondre Campbell can play pass defense. Quay Walker can play pass defense. Those guys are good in pass defense. They're not quite good in run defense, at least not this year with Devondre, right? Rasul Douglas on the outside, Jair Alexander on the outside, hopefully Eric Stokes or whatever, eventually, however they end up making that corners work. Those guys don't want to, Douglas is a good tackler, but those guys don't want to end up coming up and tackling the run. They want to play pass defense. They want to play ball hawking defense. That's the way that this defense can be set up. And this defense isn't far away, in my opinion. If you're putting up video game numbers on offense, this defense could be a pretty decent pass defense if they're playing the right way, and if these guys don't have as much to worry about from a run defense and tackling standpoint. So I'm not saying you can totally get away with that stuff, but it makes things a whole heck of a lot easier if the other team's one-dimensional and just trying to pass on you the entire game. So if what I kind of learned from this study, you need playmakers, you need a video game offense, you need a very special offense. And then if you do that, now go get after the quarterback on defense and set yourself up with some solid coverage players. And now you don't have to necessarily worry about some of those fringe things quite as much. You can have an okay running back. You can have an okay running game. You can have an okay run defense. You can have an okay special teams. You don't have to worry about all that stuff as well, because you can put up points and you can stop the other team's playmakers. And you can do that, and you have a massive recipe for success. I know I'm not reinventing the wheel here. I'm not telling you things that everyone doesn't kind of already know already, but it was really the takeaway for me as you look at the main things that matter that all four of these teams had: playmakers, pass rusher, we're really good in the passing game, we're really good at stopping the passing game. Those were the things, like, legitimately. So that's the way you have to build your team. And that's what Green Bay, Brian Gutekunst, Russ Ball, the entire front office is going to have to find some way to do a much better job of, including the coaching staff and the players, in 2023 than they did in 2022. Because of all those things today that we discussed that you need in order to win a Super Bowl, the only one that Green Bay had in the conversation was Rashawn Gary, who would have tied with Trey Hendricks, which was the worst of the four remaining teams in the Final Four. So everything else needs to be improved in a pretty significant way. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. Always appreciate you. Be right back here tomorrow. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.